The day Birdie Rourke arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, the summer of 1882 had already turned the earth the color of old bone, and every soul in town agreed she looked like trouble wrapped in a blue calico dress. She stepped off the southbound stage with one carpet bag, a busted hatbox, and a letter of introduction addressed to a man named Gerald Purvis, who was supposed to be her new employer at the town's dry goods store. Gerald Purvis, she discovered within the first 5 minutes of her arrival, had died of a fever 3 weeks prior, and his widow had already sold the store and moved east to live with her sister. The position Birdie had traveled 400 miles to fill no longer existed. The roof she had been promised no longer stood over a place she could call her own, and the 62 cents she carried in her coat pocket was everything she had to her name. She stood on the main thoroughfare of Caldwell and let the hot Kansas wind push the dust against her ankles. She did not cry. She had not cried in a very long time, and she was not about to start in front of a town full of strangers who were already watching her with the particular sideways curiosity that small frontier towns reserved for newcomers who arrived without a man at their side. Birdie Rourke was 24 years old. She had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 5 children born to a farmer who had loved his whiskey more than his land, and a mother who had worked her hands to the bone trying to make that land bear something worth keeping. She had learned early that the world did not offer a woman much in the way of soft landings, and she had built herself accordingly, with a spine like hickory and a chin that she kept level no matter what the horizon threw at her. She crossed the street to the only establishment with a handwritten sign reading rooms and inquired about a rate. The woman behind the counter, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Dobbins with sharp eyes and a shrewd mouth, quoted her a figure that made Birdie's 62 cents feel like a bad joke. "I can work for the room," Birdie said. "Cooking, cleaning, laundry, whatever you need." Mrs. Dobbins looked her over the way a horse trader appraises an unknown mare. "You cook well. Well enough to make a man forget his own name." Mrs. Dobbins almost smiled. "You can start tonight. I'll give you the back room, small, but it has a window." It was an arrangement, not a kindness, but Birdie had long since learned the difference and taken what she could get. She had been in Caldwell for 6 days, cooking breakfast and supper for Mrs. Dobbins' boarders and scrubbing the floors in between, when she first heard the name Alfred Hawkins. She heard it in the way you hear names in small towns, not all at once but in pieces. A fragment over the breakfast table, a mention at the water pump, a full sentence dropped and then hastily retrieved, as though speaking too much of the man might draw down some consequence nobody wanted to invite. "You stay away from the old Hawkins spread," one of the boarders, a traveling salesman named Creed, told her as she poured his coffee on the 7th morning. "Man out there is not right in the head." "Not right how?" Birdie asked, because she had always believed in gathering information rather than accepting the shape someone else tried to give her ignorance. Creed shifted in his seat. "He used to be a good man from what people say, had a wife and a little one. There was an accident, or maybe it wasn't an accident depending on who you ask. Either way, he shut himself up out there on that land 2 years ago, and he hasn't let a soul past his door since. Not the preacher, not the doctor, not the sheriff. Nobody. How does he eat? Boy from town leaves supplies on the porch once a week, leaves them and goes. Alfred Hawkins comes out and takes them after the boy has gone. That's the extent of his relationship with the human race, far as anyone can tell." Birdie thought about that while she cleared the table. A man who had stopped opening his door to the world. She had known grief in her life, the particular kind that makes the walls of a room seem like the only thing keeping you from dissolving entirely. She understood something about the geometry of it, about the way sorrow could reshape a person's entire relationship with space. She filed the name away and thought no more about it that morning. What changed things was the fire. It happened on the 8th night of her time in Caldwell. A lantern got knocked over in the general merchandise store 2 buildings down from Mrs. Dobbins' boarding house, and by the time the bucket brigade got organized, the whole front of the building was throwing orange light against the dark sky. Nobody was hurt, but the smoke got into Mrs. Dobbins' establishment and ruined 3 sacks of flour and made the back room, Birdie's room, smell like the inside of a chimney. In the commotion, somebody broke the window of Birdie's room. A well-meaning volunteer had smashed it with a broom handle, thinking the smoke was coming from inside rather than drifting in from next door. The window, Mrs. Dobbins informed her the following morning with a tight expression, would cost 2 weeks of Birdie's labor to replace. 2 weeks of labor she was already giving for the room itself. Birdie did the mathematics and came up short. She spent the morning walking the length of Caldwell, which did not take very long, and assessing what opportunities the town offered a woman without references, without connections, and without the kind of face that men ignored. There was a laundry run by a Chinese man named Mr. Chen, who had been in Caldwell longer than half the white residents, and who was regarded with a mixture of dependence and unkindness that made Birdie's jaw tighten when she observed it. He was pleasant to her and gave her a piece of honest advice. If you want work that pays money instead of just a roof, you need someone who needs something specific that you can do. Think about what you do that nobody else does as well. Birdie thought about what she did well. She cooked. She could mend and sew with some proficiency. She could read and write, which was more than many people in frontier towns could claim in 1882. She had spent 2 years helping her mother nurse her younger brother through a prolonged illness, and she had a knack for quiet, patient care that her mother had always said was a gift. That was when she thought again about Alfred Hawkins. Not because she had any scheme or design, but because the salesman Creed had mentioned that the man was not opening his door to anyone, had not for 2 years, and something about the particularity of that detail kept surfacing in her mind like something floating up through still water. A man alone on land, not seeing another person, subsisting on weekly supplies left on a porch. That was not living. That was a slow erasure of a person. She asked Mrs. Dobbins, carefully and without revealing too much of her thinking, where the Hawkins spread was situated. Mrs. Dobbins gave her a long look. About 4 miles northeast of town, along the creek road. But I want to tell you, girl, that man has not answered his door in 2 years. The preacher tried 6 times, the doctor twice. The sheriff himself knocked once, and Alfred Hawkins fired his rifle through the window to make the point. He did not hit anyone, but the message was received. He fired his rifle through the window, Birdie repeated. Deliberately wide, everyone understood, but the message was received. You leave that man alone. He does not want company. I am not offering company, Birdie said. I am offering work. She borrowed a horse from the livery stable the following morning, promising to return it by midday and offering 2 of her remaining coins as deposit. The creek road northeast of Caldwell ran between stands of cottonwood whose leaves had gone silver in the late summer heat, and the land on either side had the wide, undefended quality that Kansas land always had, flat and sky-heavy, and utterly exposed to whatever weather the heavens chose to deliver. She found the Hawkins spread without difficulty. It announced itself first as a windmill against the sky, one blade bent at an unnatural angle, turning slowly and off rhythm. Then came the fence line, then the barn with its doors standing open, and then the house. It was a good house. She could see that even through the evident neglect. Whoever had built it with intention. It was larger than most homestead houses she had seen, with a proper porch running along the front and windows on 3 sides. But the porch needed sweeping, and the windows were filmed with dust, and the kitchen garden to the side had gone entirely to seed and weeds, and there was a quality to the whole property of something that had been carefully made, and then simply abandoned to the passing of time. She dismounted and tied her horse to the fence post at the gate. She walked up the porch steps, her boots making deliberate sound on the boards, giving fair warning of her approach to whatever wounded, rifle-carrying man waited inside. She did not want to alarm anyone. She wanted only to be heard before she was seen. She stopped before the door. It was a solid door, oak from the look of it, with a brass handle that had gone green at the edges from disuse. No sound came from inside. The windows on either side of the door were shuttered. Birdie raised her hand and knocked. Two solid, clear knocks, not tentative, not demanding, simply present. She waited. The silence that came back was not the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of someone who was listening. She knocked a second time, the same as the first. 2 knocks, even and unhurried. 3 seconds passed, then 5. Then she heard a sound she had not expected. The sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened. Alfred Hawkins stood in the doorway, and the two of them looked at each other, and neither spoke for a long moment. He was tall, with dark hair that had grown beyond what any barber would consider acceptable, and a beard that had moved past deliberate growth into something more like forgetting. His eyes were brown, deep-set, with the particular expression of a man who has looked at something devastating for so long that he cannot quite calibrate what to do with the sight of something ordinary. He was wearing a clean shirt, she noticed, and that detail caught her somewhere she did not expect, because it suggested that whatever else he had abandoned, he had not entirely abandoned himself. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot explain and is not sure whether to be afraid of. She looked at him and registered with a clarity that surprised her that he was not what she had expected. She had been bracing for something haggard and wild, the way Creed had implied, the way Mrs. Dobbins had suggested. But what she saw was a man who was tired in a way that had gone all the way into his bones, a man who had been carrying something enormous alone for a very long time, and who looked, in this precise moment of his door standing open for the first time in 2 years, like someone who had just put down a weight so heavy he wasn't certain his hands remembered what to do without it. "My name is Birdie Rourke," she said. "I am not here to trouble you. I am here because I need work, and I understand you might need someone to help put this property to rights. I cook well, I work hard, and I don't talk when talking isn't needed. I'm asking for fair wages. Nothing more, nothing less." Alfred Hawkins looked at her for another long moment. "You knocked twice," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, the way a hinge sounds when it has not been moved in a long time. "I knocked twice," she confirmed. He seemed to consider that as though it were information of some significance, though she couldn't have said what significance it held for him. His eyes moved past her to the horse at the gate, the empty road, the wide Kansas sky, and then came back to her face. "Come in off the porch," he said. "I'll put water on." She stepped inside. The interior of the house was dim and close and smelled of wood smoke, and something else she couldn't name, something like the particular quality of a room that has been inhabited by one person for a long time. But it was not filthy. It was not the chaotic disarray she might have expected from a man who had sealed himself away from the world. It was merely sparse. He had stripped the house of certain things. She could tell from the lighter patches on the walls where pictures had once hung, from the empty spaces where furniture might have stood. He had made it into something more elemental, a shelter rather than a home. As though he was only willing to ask it to protect him from the weather, not from anything deeper. She sat at the kitchen table while he moved to the stove, and she looked around the room and held her tongue and let him move in his own rhythm without pressure. There was a bookshelf with perhaps 15 books on it, well-worn spines. There was a rifle leaning against the wall beside the door. There was a coffee pot that had seen serious use, and a cast iron pan hanging on its hook. The windows in the kitchen, unlike those in the front of the house, were unshuttered, and the afternoon light came through them and fell on everything with the particular gold quality of late summer Kansas light that was, she had already decided, one of the most beautiful and merciless things she had ever seen. "How did you know I needed help?" he asked. He set a cup of water to heat and turned to look at her. "I heard your name," she said. "I heard that you had been alone a long time. I heard that the property was not being tended. I can see that's true." He sat down across from her. He rested his hands flat on the table in the manner of a man who is making himself be present rather than retreating somewhere behind his own eyes. She respected that effort. "I am not easy company," he said. "I am not here for company. I told you, I am here for work." "What happened to your last position?" she told him plainly. "The dry goods store, the dead employer, the widow who had already gone east." She told him about Mrs. Dobbins and the broken window and the arithmetic that did not add up. She did not embellish or dramatize. She simply told him the facts in the order they had occurred. He listened without interrupting. That was not a small thing, she noticed. A man who could listen without already preparing his response while you were still speaking. She had not met many of those. "I can offer you $3 a week," he said when she had finished. "You would need to come out each day. I am not in a position to offer accommodation." "$3.50, she said. "Given the distance I'll be traveling." He looked at her. Something at the corners of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of a smile, checking briefly to see if the door was still there. $3.50, he agreed. She put out her hand across the table. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she could not fully read, then took it and shook it once firmly. His hand was warm and calloused and steady, and he released hers as quickly as was polite, and they both pretended not to notice that neither of them had been in a hurry to let go. She started the following morning. The work was substantial. 2 years of a property being maintained at the most minimal level possible left a great deal to address. The kitchen garden was a ruin, but the soil beneath the weeds was good, and she cleared it in stages over the first week, attacking the nearest section each morning while the air was still relatively cool. The root cellar was functional but disorganized. The porch needed its boards re-nailed in 3 places where they had lifted. The barn, she discovered, housed 2 horses that Alfred was maintaining with reasonable care, which told her that whatever he had let go in himself, he had not entirely abandoned his responsibilities. He was not an easy presence in the early days. He existed in the house the way weather exists, somewhere in the background, a presence you were aware of without always being able to see. She would find evidence of him: a cup set to drain, a chair moved, a window opened against the morning heat, but he himself often seemed to be in another room or outside at the back of the property, staying at the comfortable remove of a man who had decided to let her work without hovering over it. But not always. On the 3rd day she came in from the garden at noon to find him already at the stove, heating the beans she had set to soak that morning. He looked up when she came in and looked back at the pot with the expression of a man who realizes he has been caught doing something considerate and is not sure how to manage being noticed for it. "I know how to do beans," she said, washing her hands at the basin. "I know you do," he said. "I just thought I would save you the trouble." They ate at the kitchen table without much talking, and she noticed that he ate with the focused attention of someone who had been eating alone long enough that a meal in company required a kind of relearning. She also noticed that he had washed his face and combed his hair before sitting down, and that detail undid her just slightly in a way she firmly set aside. On the 5th day, she found an old fiddle on the top shelf of the pantry while she was taking inventory. She brought it to the kitchen and set it on the table without comment and went back to work. When she came in at midday, the fiddle had moved from the table to the bookshelf, and she never mentioned it. But on the 6th evening, when she was at the end of the day's work and gathering her things to make the 4-mile ride back to town, she heard it. Just a few notes, tentative and slightly out of tune, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. She stood with her hand on the door handle and listened for a moment and then quietly let herself out, and rode back to Caldwell with the sound of those notes following her the whole way. Something was shifting. She could feel it in the quality of his silences, which began to shorten. She could feel it in the way he began, gradually, to appear in the same room she was working in rather than maintaining his careful distance. He would come with a task of his own, mending harness or working on something at the table, and they would be in the same space, working separately but aware of each other, and it felt like what she imagined it must feel like to slowly warm something that has been cold for a very long time. She learned things about him in the oblique way that people learn things about each other when they are spending hours together without making it the point of the enterprise. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Ohio in 1876, when he was 26, with his wife Eleanor, and with the belief, which was common enough then and often enough wrong, that the frontier offered a man an honest chance to build something that would outlast him. He had built the house himself, with help from 2 neighboring homesteaders. He had run cattle and farmed and made the property into something worth having. His wife Eleanor had died in the winter of 1880. She had been carrying a child. Neither of them had survived. He was 32 years old now, and he had been alone in this house with this grief for 2 years, and he had not let anyone through the door. He told her this in pieces over the course of 2 weeks, never all at once. A sentence here, a detail there, as though he was testing whether the world outside his own head would treat these facts with the appropriate gravity. She received each piece without drama and without excessive sympathy, because she sensed that excessive sympathy was not what he needed. What he needed was for someone to simply hear the thing and remain standing, to demonstrate by their continued presence that the facts he carried were survivable, that they did not require a person to seal themselves away from everything. "You opened the door," she said to him one evening, about 3 weeks in. They were sitting on the porch in the cooling end of the day, a thing that had started happening without either of them planning it. The Kansas sunset was doing what Kansas sunsets did, which was paint the entire western sky in colors that seemed to have been designed by someone with no sense of restraint. "You knocked twice," he said. He had said this before. It seemed to mean something specific to him that she had not yet fully understood. "Is there something particular about the twice?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The bent windmill blade caught the last light and threw it in a slow arc. "Eleanor used to knock twice," he said. "When she was coming inside from the yard and her hands were full, she would knock the doorframe with her elbow. 2 knocks. Same sound." He paused. "I know it wasn't her. I know that perfectly well. I am not a man who confuses things. But when I heard your knock, I was already at the door before I decided to be." Birdie sat with that. The cottonwoods along the creek whispered in the evening wind. She did not try to make it into something it wasn't, did not rush to fill the silence with reassurance or sentiment. She just sat with him in the fact of it. "I'm glad you opened it," she said. He looked at her. In the fading light, his face was easier to read than it was in the full daylight of the kitchen, as though the softening of the light had softened something in his expression as well. "I think I am too," he said. Then he looked back at the sunset, and she did the same, and they sat together in the cooling evening until the sky went dark. She thought about him constantly on the ride back to town. She thought about him while she was doing Mrs. Dobbin's supper dishes, which she still did each evening as part of their arrangement. She thought about the way he listened, the way he moved through the house with a particular quietness that was not timidity but something more like consideration, as though he was trying not to disturb whatever delicate equilibrium the world contained. She thought about his hands on the table when he was thinking hard about something, spread flat the way they had been on the day she first sat across from him. She recognized what she was doing. She was not a fool. She was 24 years old, and she had been alone long enough to know what it felt like, when a person's presence began to occupy more of your thinking than was strictly accounted for by professional arrangement. She was not going to make a mess of it. She had work that she needed, and she had a man who needed the work done, and she was not going to run roughshod over the careful, fragile thing that was very slowly, like the first green shoots in the kitchen garden she had cleared, beginning to grow between them. She was patient. She had been patient her whole life. She could be patient a while longer. On the 4th week, she brought a cutting from Mrs. Dobbin's kitchen herb garden, sage and thyme wrapped in damp cloth. She planted them in the corner of the kitchen garden she had cleared, and did not make any particular announcement about it. Alfred watched her from the kitchen window while she worked the soil with her hands. That evening, when she came in to wash up before the ride back, he had set a jar on the table, a mason jar with 3 stalks of black-eyed Susans in it. They were from the patch that grew wild along the fence line, bright and unruly and completely uncurated, and they were the most flowers she had received from anyone in approximately 5 years. She looked at them for a moment. "For the table," he said from somewhere behind her. "They're lovely," she said. She heard him move in the other room. She heard the particular sound of a man who has said something tender and is not sure where to put the feeling that comes after. She left them on the table and rode back to town with her heart doing something she was not ready to name yet. The first time they had a real argument was over the fence. The north fence line needed significant repair. 3 posts had rotted at the base, and 2 of the connecting rails had split. Alfred had the lumber in the barn and the intention of doing the work himself. Birdie had come out one morning to find him at the barn with the lumber, preparing to work alone, and she had picked up the other end of the first replacement rail without asking permission. He had looked at her. "I have it," he said. "It goes faster with 2, she said. "It is fence work. It is not part of your arrangement here. If your cattle got out because the fence wasn't fixed and you had to spend 2 days tracking them down, then you couldn't pay me on Friday, which is very much part of my arrangement." He stared at her with an expression that was trying to be irritation and not quite making it. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever encountered." "That may be true," she said. "Take the other end." He took the other end. They worked the fence for the better part of the morning, and it was different from the work they did separately, because it required actual coordination, calling to each other across the length of the rail, adjusting when the other person shifted, depending on each other's judgment about level and alignment. It required looking at each other directly and frequently, and by the end of the first hour the irritation he had started with had dissolved entirely, and something much warmer had taken its place, though neither of them said anything about it. At one point she misjudged the angle of a rail and the whole thing shifted, and she went sideways with it, and he dropped his end and caught her by the arm before she went down entirely, and they were suddenly very close together in the bright morning light with his hand on her arm and her hand braced against his chest for balance, and the rail was on the ground between them and neither of them moved for a moment. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. She was not looking at him because she was not sure what she would do if she looked at him right now. "Birdie." His voice was different when he said her name in that particular tone. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the careful watchfulness or the tentative warmth or the complicated grief. He was looking at her as though he had just understood something, the way a man looks when a calculation he has been working at for a long time suddenly resolves into a clear answer. She stepped back. She picked up her end of the rail. "Come on," she said. "We've got 6 more posts." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his end of the rail. They did not speak much for the rest of the morning, but the quality of the silence was different from all the other silences they had shared. It was denser. It had weight to it, the weight of something that has been named even though no words were used. That afternoon, after the fence was done and they had eaten the midday meal and she was out in the garden, he came and sat on the upturned crate near the garden's edge and watched her work. He had the fiddle in his hands. He had not brought it outside before. He began to play, slowly at first and still with the out-of-tune quality of an instrument that had sat unused for 2 years, but the tune was clear enough. She recognized it after the first few bars, a ballad her mother used to sing, something old and southern and full of longing for things that were gone. She kept her hands in the dirt and let the music move through the afternoon air around her and did not say anything until he stopped. "You play well," she said. "I used to play better. You'll get it back." He rested the fiddle on his knee. The late afternoon light was warm on both of them. "How do you know?" "Because you're already better than you were this morning," she said. "I heard you through the wall on the 6th day. It takes time to come back to things, but if you keep playing you'll find it again." He looked at her for a long moment with that resolving expression, the arithmetic settling look. "You heard me on the 6th day. I was already at the door," she said. "I heard you. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my business. But you remembered it." "I remembered it," she said. He did not say anything else. He lifted the fiddle and played another verse, and the Kansas afternoon held them both in its gold and spacious light, and Birdie Rourke pressed her hands into the good earth of his recovered garden, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something that felt like the possibility of a future that was hers to want. It was near the end of the 5th week that the complication arrived in the form of a man named Douglas Cray. Douglas Cray was a land agent who worked out of Wichita and who had been circling the Hawkins property like a patient hawk for the better part of a year, according to Mrs. Dobbins, who shared this information with Birdie over breakfast one morning as though it were simply news and not specifically relevant to her current situation. "He's been trying to buy out Alfred Hawkins," Mrs. Dobbins said. "Figures a man in that state won't hold out forever. Land like that, good water access on the creek, he could turn it in a profitable direction. There's a railroad survey coming through next year that would make the whole northeast quarter of the county considerably more valuable." Birdie filed this information with the rest of her gathered intelligence about Alfred Hawkins's situation. Cray arrived at the Hawkins property on a Thursday, which was the day Birdie had taken to coming out early, before the real heat of the day. She was in the kitchen when she heard a horse on the road, and she looked out the window and saw a man in a too-good-for-the-territory coat and a hat that belonged in a city coming through the gate. Alfred was at the barn. She went to the front door and opened it before Cray got to the porch, which stopped him mid-step. He was a well-groomed man in his 40s with the particular brand of smooth confidence that comes from years of talking people out of things they wanted to keep. "I'm looking for Alfred Hawkins," he said. "He is occupied," Birdie said. "Can I tell him what you need?" Cray smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind with no actual warmth behind it. "I'm Douglas Cray from the Cray and Associates Land Agency in Wichita. I have a business proposition for Mr. Hawkins that I believe he'll find very favorable. I've spoken with him before." "You have tried to speak with him before," Birdie said, making the distinction deliberately. "I understand the conversation didn't progress very far." Cray's smile didn't waver. "Things change. A man's circumstances change. I thought it might be worth revisiting." "They don't change in ways that would benefit you," Alfred said. They both turned. He had come around the side of the house and was standing at the corner of the porch, and there was a quality to his posture that had not been there even a month ago, Birdie registered. He was standing upright and clear, none of the hunched inwardness she had first noted in the man at the door. He was looking at Cray with the level, uncomplicated directness of a man who knows what he wants and what he does not want. "Hawkins," Cray said. He switched his attention smoothly, the way water finds a new channel when the first is blocked. "Good to see you looking well. I wanted to talk about the north section. I've got interested buyers, good honest money." "No," Alfred said. "The railroad survey, I know about the survey, no. A man alone, a property this size, it's a considerable burden." "I am not alone," Alfred said. There was a moment of silence. Birdie became aware that both men were, in slightly different ways, looking at her. "Miss Rourke works here," Alfred said to Cray, in a tone that contained significantly more than those words. "And the property is not for sale. I'd appreciate you taking that as a final answer." Cray looked between them. His practiced smile took on an edge that was not quite unpleasant but was definitely recalibrating. "Well, you know where to find me if you change your mind." "I know where to find you," Alfred said. "Good day, Mr. Cray." Cray left the way he had come. Alfred remained at the corner of the porch until the sound of the horse on the road faded. Then he came up onto the porch and stood beside Birdie, looking at the empty road with his arms loosely crossed. "He'll come back," Birdie said. "Let him," Alfred said. "The answer won't change." She looked at him, he looked at her. They were standing close enough that she could have counted the particular geography of his face if she had wanted to. The line between his brows that deepened when he was thinking hard, the slight asymmetry of his mouth, the way his eyes, in the direct afternoon light, were not simply brown, but contained threads of amber and deep green like creek water over good stone. "I am not alone," he said, more quietly this time, as though he was trying the sentence again to see how it felt in a register that had nothing to do with Douglas Cray. "No," she said, "you are not." They stayed on the porch for a while after that, not touching, not talking, just standing together in the afternoon with the weight of the sentence between them. And Birdie thought that perhaps this was its own kind of tenderness, this standing together in the plain light of the day without needing to make it into anything more than what it was. But it was becoming more. She knew that as clearly as she knew the temperature of the water in the creek or the angle of the afternoon light through the kitchen window. It was becoming more, whether she was careful with it or not. She took the long way back to Caldwell that evening, along the creek road where the cottonwoods made their silver sound in the late breeze, and she let herself think about it openly, without the careful management she had been applying to the feeling for weeks. She thought about what it would mean. She thought about what she wanted. She thought about a man who had sealed himself away from the world for 2 years and had opened his door to her twice-knocked summons, and who was slowly, carefully, like a field coming back from a long winter, returning to life. She wanted him. She was not ashamed of it. She was 24 years old and she had lived carefully and responsibly for most of that time, and she was not going to apologize for wanting something real and warm and solid with a man who listened and who planted black-eyed Susans in a jar on the kitchen table, and who played the fiddle in the evening, and who had said "I am not alone" in a voice that contained every feeling he had not yet found the words for. She wanted him. She would be patient. She would let it find its own way. She did not have to be patient much longer. It was on a Sunday in the 8th week that she arrived to find him already in the garden, not gardening but standing in it, looking at what the two of them had brought it back to over the course of the summer. The herbs were doing well. There were beans and squash that she had planted in the first week starting to set fruit. The kitchen garden looked like a kitchen garden again, and he was standing in it in the early morning light looking at it with an expression on his face that she felt in her chest like a struck note. She came through the gate and he turned and saw her, and the expression did not change, did not become more guarded or more managed. He just let her see it. "It looks like something again," he said. "It does," she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning was still cool and clear, the kind of morning that Kansas offered sometimes between the heat of summer and the coming of autumn, when everything felt poised and just exactly itself. "I owe you a great deal," he said. "You pay me $3.50 a week," she said. "You owe me nothing." "That is not what I mean." He paused. He looked down at the soil at his feet and then back at her, and she could see him organizing himself the way she had watched him organize himself before difficult things, choosing the words, finding the courage for them. "I mean the rest of it. I mean what has happened out here this summer. I was not—" He stopped, started again. "I was in a bad way, Birdie. I don't think I understood how bad until you knocked on that door and I heard myself answer it and I saw my own hands opening the bolt. I had not known I was still capable of that, of answering, of letting someone in." She stayed very still. The garden was quiet around them. A meadowlark was singing somewhere on the fence line. "You did not need to let anyone in who was not worth letting in," she said. "No," he said. "I did not." He looked at her with the full, clear steadiness of his brown eyes with their amber and green depths. "I would like to ask you something." "Ask." "Are you in Caldwell to stay, or are you somewhere in between, on your way to somewhere else?" She thought about that. She thought about Caldwell, which had nothing particular to recommend it except that it was where she had landed. She thought about Missouri, which had nothing pulling her back to it. She thought about the road she had been on since her mother died, the practical, forward-facing road of a woman who was making the best of what was available. "I am wherever makes sense to be," she said. "I haven't found a reason to be any particular place permanently." He took a breath. "I would like to give you one," he said, "if you were willing." She looked at him. The morning light was doing its particular early-hour work on everything, making it clean and distinct and full of possibility. "Alfred Hawkins," she said, "are you trying to tell me something?" "I am telling you," he said, "that I have not felt like a man who had something to offer anyone in 2 years, and I'm telling you that somewhere in the last 8 weeks that changed." And I'm telling you that I am aware you came here for work and for wages, and that I don't want to make your position here uncomfortable. And I would rather say this plainly and have you tell me I've misread everything than go on not saying it." "You have not misread anything," she said. Something in him released. She could see it, like a long-held breath, like a tension that had been built into his posture. For so long it had started to seem like his natural shape finally easing into something more open. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with whatever counts as properly out here, which I admit is a limited range of options. I would like to ask if I can call on you in town, and if you would be willing to walk with me on a Sunday, and if you would—" "Alfred," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, and smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that started in the eyes before it reached the mouth. And when he saw it, something shifted in his face that she was quite certain she was seeing for the first time, a real, uncomplicated, unreserved happiness that he had not had occasion to show anyone in a very long time. He took one step toward her, and then stopped, as though he was still negotiating permission from some careful part of himself. She solved that for him by closing the remaining distance herself and taking his hand in both of hers, and they stood in the recovered garden in the clear morning light, holding hands like two people who had both been traveling a long road separately and had arrived, a little dusty and somewhat the worse for wear, at the same destination. "I should have knocked twice sooner," she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was better than the fiddle, better than anything. It was full and surprised and genuine, the laugh of a man who has rediscovered that his body still knows how to make that sound. They walked back to the house together, still holding hands, and she made coffee while he sat at the kitchen table with a look on his face that she thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life if she got nothing else from this. The courtship, as Alfred had called it, was conducted with a seriousness of purpose that Birdie found both endearing and, privately, deeply moving. He was not a man who did anything by half measures once he had decided to do it. He came to Caldwell on the first Sunday after their conversation in the garden, cleaned up and in his best coat, with his hair combed and his hat in his hand, and he asked Mrs. Dobbins if he might take Miss Rourke for a walk, which made Mrs. Dobbins' eyebrows rise to a height that Birdie had not previously observed them capable of. They walked the length of Caldwell, and then out along the road where the cottonwoods grew, and he told her about Ohio, about the farm his father had run, about the two older brothers who had stayed and the one younger who had gone to the war and not come back. He told her about coming west in 1876 with a leaner, who had been fearless and full of laughter, and who had made the house a home from the first week. He told her this without the quality of a man erecting a barrier, but with the quality of a man who is introducing two important parts of his life to each other, showing her what had been so she understood what had come after and what was being built now. She told him about Missouri, about her father and the farm that had never quite been enough, about her mother's capable, tired hands, about her brothers and sisters scattered now across 3 states. She told him about the 2 years after her mother died when she had worked in a dress shop in St. Louis, and saved what she could, and learned how to navigate a world that did not automatically offer a woman a table at which to sit. They told each other the truth, and the truth fit together in the way that things fit when they are made of the same material. He came the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. He brought the fiddle one evening when she had prevailed upon Mrs. Dobbins to allow a small gathering for the boarders, and he played in the parlor, and his playing had improved considerably in the weeks since he had found it again, grown fuller and more sure. And Birdie sat across the room and watched his hands on the strings and felt the particular, unreasonable pride of someone who cares deeply for a person they cannot claim yet. In October, when the first cold came down from the north and the cottonwoods turned gold along the creek road, he asked her to marry him. They were on the porch in the evening. She had started staying later as the weeks went on, and Mrs. Dobbins had made no particular issue of it because she was too shrewd not to understand what was developing. The sunset was doing its immodest best in the western sky, all orange and violet and a deep arterial red along the horizon. He had been quiet through most of the evening, a thoughtful quiet rather than a troubled one. She had come to know the difference. She had come to know most of his varieties of silence the way you learn the particular dialects of a landscape you've been walking long enough. He reached into his coat pocket and placed on the table between them a small ring. It was a plain gold band, simple and worn, and she understood from the look on his face that it had been his mother's, not Alina's, and that he had kept it all these years at the bottom of whatever drawer held the things you couldn't use but couldn't let go of. "I have been thinking about the right words for this," he said, "and I have come to the conclusion that there probably aren't any that are quite adequate, so I am going to say the plain ones. I would like to spend whatever I have left to give on you, Birdie. I would like to build something with you here that is worth having. I would like to be the man who gets to watch you walk through that gate every morning and know you are coming home. I am asking you to marry me." She looked at the ring on the table between them. She looked at his face, which was open and steady and lit by the last of the sunset, and she thought about that first morning, the door swinging open, the bolt drawn back, the man who had not opened his door to anyone in 2 years and who had opened it to her on 2 knocks. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she put her hand against his cheek, and they sat in the last of the autumn light like two people who have come through a long passage and arrived somewhere worth arriving. They married in November of 1882 in the small frame church in Caldwell, with Mrs. Dobbins and Mr. Chen and the traveling salesman Creed, who happened still to be in town and who looked genuinely moved, as the witnesses. The preacher who married them was a patient man named Reverend Aldridge, who had once himself tried to knock on Alfred Hawkins's door and been firmly declined, and who performed the ceremony with a generosity of spirit that Birdie appreciated. Alfred wore his best coat and had had his hair properly cut for the first time in longer than he cared to specify, and he looked, Birdie thought, standing at the front of that small church with the November light coming through the plain glass windows, like a man who had come all the way back from wherever grief had taken him and was standing now exactly where he was supposed to be. She wore the blue calico dress she had arrived in Caldwell wearing, cleaned and pressed, with a sprig of dried black-eyed Susans tucked into her hair, because Alfred had dried a bunch of them from the fence line in October, and she had discovered them hanging in the kitchen and understood, without needing any explanation, what he had meant by it. She walked up the aisle of that small church, and she did not look anywhere but at him, and he did not look anywhere but at her, and when Reverend Aldridge asked if they took each other, they both said yes, with a conviction that made even the Reverend's measured expression soften. After the ceremony, Alfred played the fiddle at the small gathering in Mrs. Dobbins' parlor, and he played well, better than he had at the earlier evening, with the ease of something fully recovered. He played the ballad her mother had loved and watched Birdie's face while he played it, and the watching was not sorrow, but something that had come through sorrow to the other side. They rode out to the Hawkins property together in the early evening, Birdie on the horse from the livery and Alfred on his own, and the creek road in November had exchanged the gold cottonwood leaves for bare branches against a pale gray sky, and it was beautiful in the particular strip-back, honest way that bare things can be beautiful, all structure and no concealment. She moved her few things into the house, and it received them without resistance, as though it had been waiting for them. The first winter of their marriage was cold and full and better than either of them had words for. Birdie brought her specific competencies to the management of the property and Alfred brought his, and the combination turned out to be considerably greater than the sum of its parts. She had ideas about the garden that went beyond what he had originally established, and he had knowledge of the land and the cattle and the seasonal rhythms of the Kansas plain that she did not have but absorbed quickly. They argued sometimes, productively, in the way of people who are both particular and capable, and who have not yet entirely mapped each other's thinking. They always found their way to agreement eventually, usually at the kitchen table over coffee. He played the fiddle in the evenings, and she sometimes sang with it, songs she had learned from her mother, and the house, which had been so long a place of singular, sealed grief, became a place where music lived. In the spring of 1883, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with the directness that was characteristic of her, sitting across the table from him with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on his face. The look that moved through him was complex and quick. She had thought carefully about how this might land, given what he had carried and what he had lost, and she had prepared herself to be patient with whatever shape his feeling took. What it took was not what she had expected. He stood up from the table and came around to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that was grief and joy and gratitude so thoroughly woven together that they were indistinguishable from each other. And he said, very quietly, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Ask me again after about 6 more months." He laughed, and she felt it in her chest in the same way she had felt his first laugh, the same surprise and fullness, and she put her hands over his on her face and held them there. The pregnancy went well. She was healthy and stubborn, and refused to be treated as fragile, which Alfred accepted after a brief period of hovering that she tolerated for longer than she might have, because she understood what animated it. She kept working in the garden into the summer and kept doing the kitchen work and let him take over certain heavier tasks that she surrendered without making a production of it. He worried. She knew he worried. She found him sometimes in the evening looking at her with a watchfulness that had a specific quality, a man keeping watch against the possibility of something he had lived through once and could not fully stop bracing for. She did not tell him not to worry because that was an instruction nobody could follow. She simply let him see her, each day, present and capable and increasingly large, and she let that be the evidence that the worry could rest against. The neighbors came during that spring and summer, which was itself a development that would have been unimaginable a year before. The homesteaders to the south, a family named Brecken, came to call in April and were received on the porch with coffee, and a civility that Alfred had clearly required some effort to achieve, but which grew easier as the visit went on. By the end of the afternoon, he and Jonas Brecken had been talking about cattle and fencing with the ease of men who have known each other for years and simply been out of practice. Birdie watched this from her chair and felt again that specific, unreasonable pride. By summer, there was a degree of normalcy to their lives that was not at all ordinary to either of them, because they had both come from circumstances that had required a continuous fight to maintain anything like stability. And this, the garden and the cattle and the neighbors and the music in the evenings and each other, felt like something won rather than something assumed. They treated it accordingly, with care and deliberate attention, as though they both understood that good things required the active participation of the people who wanted to keep them. The baby was born in September of 1883, with a Kansas thunderstorm conducting itself outside the windows and Mrs. Brecken from the neighboring farm acting as midwife, because Birdie had made arrangements well in advance and was not a woman who left such things to chance. It was a boy. A boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's level, considering gaze, which he applied to the world from the first hour with a seriousness of purpose that suggested he found it a complex place, and intended to think about it carefully. Alfred held his son with the particular focused intentness of a man who has waited a long time for something and who cannot quite believe it is real enough to hold, and he looked at Birdie over the baby's head with an expression that she thought afterward was the one she would always remember when she thought about him, the one that was simply love without any qualification or complexity. "What do we call him?" Alfred asked. "I thought Thomas," she said. "After your brother." He was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the baby, who was making the thoughtful, focused expression that Birdie was already beginning to understand was his characteristic register. "Thomas," Alfred said. "Yes. Thomas Hawkins grew up on the Kansas plain with the particular confidence of a child who is loved well and who has enough space around him to learn the shape of himself without interference. He was a serious boy who became more joyful as he grew, which was the best possible direction to grow in, and he had his father's ear for music and his mother's stubbornness. And the particular combination of the two was something that filled the house with a quality of life that made the house itself seem more alive. In 1885, Douglas Cray came back. He came on a weekday morning, unannounced, in a different coat that suggested the land agency was doing well. He found Alfred and Birdie both in the yard, which he had presumably not anticipated, and he had the good sense to modulate his approach accordingly. "I wanted to offer my congratulations," he said, looking from one to the other with his practiced smile showing evidence of genuine recalibration. "I heard you'd married, and I understand there's a child. The property looks excellent," he added, and this was true. 2.5 years of consistent work had put the Hawkins spread back into the kind of condition that made you understand what it had originally been intended to be. "Thank you," Alfred said. "I won't waste your time," Cray said, which was at least an honest opener. "I still have interested buyers. The railroad survey has confirmed what we expected about land values in this section, and I am authorized to offer you a figure considerably higher than what I mentioned before." He named a figure. It was a significant sum. Birdie and Alfred both heard it. Birdie held her position and her expression, and let Alfred lead this because it was his land, and she had given her opinion on it at home, and it was not her place to speak for him in front of Cray. "No," Alfred said. He said it with the same simplicity he had used 2 years ago, but it carried more weight now because the man saying it was clearly no longer a man in a diminished state. He was a man who knew what he had. "I built this place with my hands. I am raising my son here. My wife has planted this garden. The railroad survey makes what I have worth more to me, not less. So the answer is no, Mr. Cray, and I would respectfully ask that you don't come back." Cray looked at them both for a moment. Then he nodded once with something that was not quite respect but was perhaps the functional equivalent, the acknowledgement of a man who has run out of angles. "Good day to you both," he said, and left. He did not come back. In the years that followed, the Hawkins property put down roots in the most literal and figurative sense. Birdie expanded the kitchen garden to twice its size and began, with the careful study of a woman who reads everything she can get her hands on, to experiment with different growing methods she had read about in a farming almanac. Alfred expanded the cattle operation, buying several good stock animals at the Caldwell market and investing the time in their management that steady profit requires. They acquired a dog, a cattle dog named Red, who attached himself primarily to Thomas and secondarily to everyone else in the household. They acquired 3 more chickens to add to the 2 that had survived from Alfred's pre-marriage arrangement. They acquired, eventually, neighbors who were genuinely friends, the Breckons to the south and a family called Harmon who homesteaded the adjacent quarter section to the east in 1884 and turned out to be people worth knowing. The house itself changed. Pictures went back on the walls, not the ones that had been removed because they were gone, but new ones. A small painting of the Kansas plain that Birdie bought from a traveling artist who came through Caldwell in the summer of 1884. A framed piece of embroidery that Mrs. Dobbins, in an unprecedented act of sentiment, gave them as a wedding gift. A drawing that Thomas made at age 4 that Birdie framed with a seriousness of purpose that made Alfred love her so acutely he had to leave the room for a moment. The fiddle moved from the shelf to the wall, hung where it could be reached easily, and it was reached easily because Alfred played it several evenings a week and Thomas was learning, and the evenings in that house, in the late 1880s, were full of music and light, and the kind of noise that only children and dogs and contentment generate together. Birdie sometimes thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Caldwell with 62 cents and a busted hat box and a letter for a dead man, and she felt for that woman a tenderness that was not quite pity but was something close to it, The feeling of seeing someone who is about to find out that the road they are on, which looks completely unpromising, is actually going somewhere they cannot yet see. She had not known what she was riding toward on that creek, road northeast of Caldwell on the morning she had borrowed the livery horse and set out to knock on the door of a man she had never met. She had known only that she needed work, that she was short of options, that she had heard a name that caught in her like a thorn, and that 2 knocks on a door was as good a way as any to find out if something was on the other side. She had not known. And yet, looking back, with Thomas at the kitchen table doing his letters and Alfred coming in from the barn with the particular unhurried ease of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, she felt with absolute certainty that the road had known. That whatever combination of circumstance and need and pure stubborn willingness had brought her to that porch had been operating with an accuracy she had not been in a position to appreciate at the time. Alfred came in from the barn and shed his coat and washed his hands at the basin and came to the table and sat across from her and looked at his son making the careful shapes of letters with his tongue between his teeth, and then looked at his wife, and the look was so ordinary and so full that Birdie had to look down at the thing she was mending for a moment to hold herself in. "You're doing well," Alfred said to Thomas, leaning over to assess the letters. "The bee is hard," Thomas said, with the philosophical resignation of a person who has identified a genuine problem and is thinking seriously about it. "The bee is always hard," Alfred said. "Was it hard for you?" Alfred considered this. "I seem to recall it was the K that gave me trouble. Your grandmother had to show me about 30 times. Did you cry?" Alfred looked at Birdie with an expression that was the best kind of helpless. "I may have cried the one time," he admitted. Thomas nodded, apparently reassured that this fell within acceptable parameters, and returned to the bee. Birdie looked at the 2 of them across the kitchen table, and she thought that she had not cried at the stage stop in Caldwell, had not cried when she had 62 cents and no position and no roof, had not cried through all the practical difficulties and the cold mornings and the long road of those first difficult weeks. But she thought she might cry now, not from any sorrow or difficulty, but from the overwhelming, uncomplicated abundance of what she was looking at. She held it together. She was still Birdie Rourke after all, even if she was also Birdie Hawkins. She had not become a woman who cried into her mending. But she reached across the table and put her hand on Alfred's arm, and he put his hand over hers without looking up from his son's letters. And they stayed that way, the 3 of them at the kitchen table in the lamplight, while the Kansas wind moved around the outside of the house and found no way in. The second child arrived in the spring of 1886, a girl they called Clara, with her mother's green eyes and her father's quiet intensity, and a voice that carried considerably better than either of them, particularly at night, though this was a temporary situation that resolved itself within a few months into something more manageable. Thomas received Clara with the cautious assessment of a 3-year-old who has been the uncontested center of a household and is not entirely sure about the redistribution of attention that a sibling implies. But Clara had a way of looking at people that bypassed their defenses, and Thomas was not immune to it. By the time she was walking, he was following her around the yard with the attitude of a bodyguard who has not been asked for his services, but is providing them regardless. Life on the Hawkins property in the late 1880s took on the layered, daily richness of a place that is being built year by year by people who intend to stay. The fence that Birdie and Alfred had repaired together in that first charged morning of their courtship was repaired again, properly this time, with good cedar posts. The windmill was fixed, its bent blade straightened by a man Alfred brought out from Caldwell who had the specific skill for it, and after that it turned with an even sound that became part of the background music of the place. Mr. Chen from Caldwell came to dinner one Sunday in the summer of 1887, at Birdie's invitation, and was received with the straightforward warmth that Birdie had always shown him and that Alfred, having come to understand through Birdie's clear-sighted commentary on it, why the town's treatment of Mr. Chen constituted a particular kind of injustice dressed up as normalcy, was careful to match. Mr. Chen brought a jar of preserved plums and stayed the afternoon and played checkers with Thomas, and when he left he said to Birdie at the gate that she had made something good here and she thanked him and meant it. The Reverend Aldridge came to dinner as well, on a separate occasion, and sat at the table where he had once, years before, stood on the other side of a shut door and received no response. He had the grace not to mention it, and Alfred had the grace to welcome him, and the dinner was a good one. And afterward Alfred played the fiddle, and Reverend Aldridge, it turned out, could sing in a bass voice that the children found astonishing. In 1888, a third child arrived. Another boy, whom they called James, after Birdie's eldest brother, the one who was farming in Iowa and who wrote letters that arrived 3 months after they were sent, and who Birdie missed with the steady, low-grade ache of someone who understands that geography is the kind of grief that doesn't resolve but becomes habitual. James was a different order of being from his siblings. Where Thomas was serious and Clara was watchful, James was simply joyful, waking each day with an enthusiasm for existence that showed no signs of diminishing, who pursued the dog and the chickens and the world in general with an energy that required active parenting, and who filled the house with a noise that was occasionally overwhelming and always, Birdie found, when she got to the end of the day and thought about it, the best possible sound. Alfred, watching his 3 children in the yard one evening from the porch, was overtaken by something that he sat with in the quiet way he had always sat with strong feeling. Birdie came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him and saw what was on his face. "You all right?" she asked. "I am the furthest thing from not all right that I have ever been," he said. She gave him his coffee and put her shoulder against his. He put his arm around her and they sat on the porch in the September evening while the children ran in the last light, and Red the cattle dog conducted his hopeless campaign against the chickens with the dedication of an animal who has never let repeated failure affect his ambition. 2 years, he said. "What? I was alone in there for 2 years, he said. He said it not with grief, she noticed, but with a kind of wondering amazement, as though he was calculating a distance and finding it both vast and, from where he now stood, almost unimaginable. "And then you knocked twice. And then you opened the door," she said. "Immediately," he said. "I opened it immediately." She leaned into him. He tightened his arm around her. Thomas had caught Clara and was carrying her on his back with the improbable strength of a 5-year-old who has decided he is capable of it. James had fallen down and gotten up again with the minimal drama of a child for whom falling is simply a logistical stage in getting somewhere. "I did not know what was on the other side of that door," Birdie said. "I want you to know that. I came because I needed work and I had heard a name and I thought maybe the work was there. I did not know." "No," he said, "but I think I knew," she said, "that whatever was on the other side of a door that hadn't opened in 2 years was probably worth knocking on." He turned his head and looked at her profile in the evening light. "You knocked twice," he said. "I always knock twice," she said. "I know," he said, and kissed her temple, and she felt that all the way down to her feet. The evening settled around the house and the family in the yard and the porch, where 2 people sat together with their coffee growing cold in the cups, and the Kansas sky went about its immodest transition from light to dark in the west, and Red gave up on the chickens for the night, and Thomas put Clara down, and Clara immediately sat in the dirt to examine something she had found there. And James pursued a firefly with the focused intensity of a child who has just discovered that the world contains fireflies. Alfred Hawkins thought about 2 years of closed doors and an empty house, and the weight of grief he had carried with a stubbornness he mistook for strength. He thought about the morning a woman he had never met had walked up his porch steps in her blue calico dress and knocked twice on his door with the steady, unhurried confidence of someone who believes in what she is doing. He thought about his own hands on the bolt, moving before he made any conscious decision, moved by a sound that lived somewhere in the architecture of him below the level of thought. He thought about all of it, and he thought about what he was looking at now. The yard and the children and the recovered garden and the fixed windmill turning in the evening wind. And the woman beside him who had brought all of it back to life by the simple, radical act of refusing to accept that a closed door was a final answer. Birdie Rourke thought about 62 cents and a dead employer and a broken window, and the conversation over breakfast with a man named Creed who had told her about a man who hadn't opened his door to anyone in 2 years. She thought about what she had been looking for on the creek road that morning, which she was honest enough to admit was simply a way to survive the next week, and what she had found, which was so much larger than that. She thought about the way he had looked in the doorway. She thought about black-eyed Susans in a mason jar. She thought about a fiddle found on a shelf and played haltingly through the wall. She thought about the ring on her finger, his mother's ring, plain and worn and exactly right. She thought about Thomas at the kitchen table struggling with the letter B and James in the yard chasing fireflies and Clara sitting in the dirt with the serious expression of a scientist examining a specimen. And she thought that the road that had seemed so entirely unpromising on that first day in Caldwell had delivered her here with a precision that felt, from this vantage point, less like accident and more like something that had known where it was going even when she didn't. She was grateful for it. She was grateful in the specific, unflashy way of a woman who does not believe in taking good things for granted, because she has had enough experience of their absence to know what absence costs. She was grateful each morning when she woke in a house that was hers and each evening when she sat on this porch, and she was grateful in the middle of ordinary days over the beans or the mending or the accounts, with a quietness that did not diminish the feeling but simply let it settle into the fabric of the daily life they had made. "Come on," she said, standing and collecting the cups. "Those children need to be in before full dark." "Thomas," Alfred called across the yard. "Clara, James." "Time to come in." Thomas came immediately. Clara came after a further examination of her found object. James, with the philosophical resignation of a child who finds the end of a firefly pursuit genuinely moving, came last. They moved into the house, all 5 of them and the dog who had appointed himself their shadow, and the lamps were lit, and the last of the evening settled into the ordinary commotion of children being put to bed, which was never quiet and always, when you were inside it, the most specific and irreplaceable sound in the world. Later, when the house was quiet and the children were sleeping and Red was in his corner, and the Kansas night was doing its deep, star-heavy work outside all the windows, Alfred and Birdie sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and drank the last of the coffee and said very little, in the way of people who are so thoroughly known to each other that silence carries as much content as language. The front door was shut against the night. Not locked. It had not been locked in years. It stood in its frame, solid and well-made, the brass handle polished back to its original brightness, ready to be opened whenever someone with reason to knock came to knock on it. The house breathed around them, steady and full, the house that had been built with intention and lost its way and found its way back, that had been sealed and opened and filled again with exactly what it was built to contain. Music and meals and children and the daily, uncelebrated work of 2 people building something together that would outlast them. Alfred looked at his wife across the kitchen table. Birdie looked at her husband. She knocked twice on the wood of the table with her knuckles softly just to see what he would do. He opened his hand toward her, palm up on the tabletop. She put her hand in it. Outside, the Kansas night was wide and full of stars, and the windmill turned in the steady wind, all its blades even now, and the creek moved along its course with the patient industry of water that has somewhere to be and no reason to hurry, and the land lay open and enduring in every direction, just as it always had and would for a long time yet to come.